Shavuot Tov, everybody! I'm excited to learn with you tonight. Tonight we are going to read an excerpt from Zikaron Zot, the writings of the Hozei of Lublin. It's a timely text in that the verse from the Torah that the Hozei is going to be writing on is the mitzvah of first fruits, bringing the first fruits to the temple on Shavuot. Only, we'll see what to him this mitzvah actually means. Part of it is the physical bringing of the first fruits, but what the text teaches us is something much deeper, putting fruit in a basket and taking it to the temple. So why don't we jump right into it? Just by way of biography, the Hozei of Lublin, I don't know when he was born, but he died in 1815, so figure he was born early to mid 18th century and died in 1815. The Hozei of Lublin. So he writes, "The first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. Thou shalt not cook a kid in its mother's milk." This is a verse from Exodus chapter 23, verse 19. I'll read it again just so we can keep it in mind. So I'll read it again. It says, "The first fruits of your land you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk." And so there is an obvious question here. Why the juxtaposition between the first fruits and that commandment not to cook a kid in its mother's milk? This is what you might call chomer lidrush, which means it's clay from which to build a drash on. And the Hozei of Lublin is going to answer that question. What's the connection between that verse and the following line, you shouldn't cook a kid in its mother's milk? So he says, "So far as I remember, the work Shevat Musar advises a person before carrying out any worldly matters, before eating and drinking, to say, with open mouth and a full voice, these words, 'I am about to eat, so that I shall have strength to do the will of God, and in order to obey God's command to me, to look after my health and to eat and be satisfied.' And so, one should do this in connection with all physical things, as it's said in the work Chovot HaLevavot. And so too, when one journeys forth to sell one's wares, one should say, with open mouth and a full voice, 'I am about to journey forth to sell my wares, so that I should have money for the purpose of honoring God, to pay the fees to those who teach my children, so that they'll grow up to be scholars who busy themselves in Torah and the mitzvot for the sake of heaven, and so that I shall be able to honor Shabbat and to give charity and tithes.' In this way, one binds occupations to God, even though afterwards one experiences physical pleasure. The latter is only in his mind, whereas the main intention was both in the mind and in speech, and everything depends on in which it began. The result of it will be that one will be helped inasmuch as one's motive is for the sake of heaven, and one's conduct will not prevent one's attachment to God." So what is the connection here between this verse, "the first fruits you shall bring to the Lord your God," and the mitzvah he says here, before partaking in any physical pleasure of this world, before eating and drinking, before going out to make money in your business, He says that one should first, before doing anything, say with a full voice this kind of formula, which is, I'm about to do this for the honor of God, to such and such. If it's food, to keep myself healthy so that I may serve the Lord my God. If it's to make money, it's so that I can pay for the teachers who teach my children Torah, so that I can use the money to honor Shabbat and give tzedakah. Then he says, what that is bringing first fruits. In the Torah, it's Reshit Bikurei, which is to say, the very first thing you do is going to define the entire rest of what you're doing. So he says, even though in making money, for instance, you receive a personal benefit, some kind of pleasure from this money, because the intention itself from the outset, in mind and in speech, was for the purpose of connecting to God, the entire act itself will always be blessed, will always lead to devekut, to a closeness to God, and no matter what comes of it, you can't take that away because you've brought that to God. Everything, he says, depends on the beginning. This is a lesson that throughout teaching Hasidut, I know I've taken to heart. A few weeks ago, we studied a teaching that said when you wake up in the morning, I believe it was Elimelech of Lejinsk, who said, when you wake up in the morning, you should strive to have no interruptions between getting out of bed and davening and praying to God, because the very first thing you do is going to define the of whatever's coming. The first moment of your day is going to define the rest of your day. The first moment you leave your house to go to work, that intention you set, whether or not you even remember that you made that intention, he says, is going to define the rest of the day. What I love about this is he doesn't expect somebody to be constantly engrossed in the idea of connecting to God. It's a very reasonable thing he asks as far as our goal, the Hasidic goal here of devekut, of connecting to God. He says, when you go to eat and drink, when you go out to work, these things which have, on the surface, no real connection to God, you don't need to focus on God the entire time in order to achieve devekut. Remember, devekut's the Hasidic goal of being connected deeply to God, throughout one's days. He says you don't need to focus on God the entire time, just in the beginning. And that's enough. It's a very reasonable thing to ask. Now, let's compare that to the following text from the Hozei of Lublin. He continues is about the question of, this is for earthly pleasures, things like eating and drinking, for going to work, but it's different when it comes to mitzvot. And this is where we're going to get into the second verse. You shouldn't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Why were they juxtaposed, this mitzvah of first fruit and the prohibition of cooking a kid in its mother's milk? Now, admittedly, it's kind of hard to explain this. So if we get jumbled up while we're explaining it, you'll forgive me. And but we'll land safely on the ground with an understanding of this verse. So he continues. He says, thus we can explain the verse. The beginning of the fruition of your land. The beginning referring to the thought, and the fruition to its verbal utterance. So he uses the verse to explain that it takes both. It takes intention, and it takes a verbal expression in order to achieve, this Dveikut, to set the intention properly for one's eating, drinking, and going about one's worldly affairs. This will cause you to bring your land, denoting your worldly interests, to the house of the Lord your God. Whenever one should not rely on this principle so far as his studies... it says, however, one should not rely on this principle so far as one's studies of Torah and prayers are concerned. Here, one should have fear and love of God even at the time when one is actually engaged in the task. So he's going to explain now why mitzvot, Torah study, and prayer are different. He says, for worldly affairs, it's enough if at the beginning you bring your land, the first fruits of your land, into the house of God. That is to say, you use intention and verbal expression to take your worldly experience and raise it to the level of godliness. But when it comes to mitzvot and Torah and prayer, it's not enough to do it at the beginning. You have to have the intention of fear and love of God the entire time, from the moment you begin to pray through the end of prayers, through the moment you begin Torah study till you close the book, from the moment you take up a lulav and you shake it till you put it down, no matter what mitzvah it is, it's not enough if you set the intention at the beginning. Rather, you have to keep that intention of love and fear and dveikut the entire time. Why does he say this? We'll continue. He says, now, the thought that one has to do something in a particular way is called the mother and the root of conduct. If one relies on the intention one had from the beginning, also in connection with the Torah and prayer, relying on the fact that one had this thought and had said the Kabbalistic formula, L'Shem Yichud. This is a formula similar to what he said one should say before eating and drinking. I'm doing this for the sake of serving God. Before doing mitzvot, there's also a formula one says. Here, I'll show it to you in here. Before counting the Omer, for instance, one says this phrase. You can see it in most traditional Sidurim. Here it is down here. It says, L'Shem Yichud Kutsha Brichu Shechinte B'Dchilu Urachimu Liyached Shem Yudhei B'Vavhei B'Yehuda Shalim B'Shem Kol Yisrael. This is an intention one says before doing a mitzvah. And it means, for the sake of the unification of the Holy One, blessed be God and God's presence, in fear and love, to unify the name Yud-Hey with Vav-Hey, in perfect unity in the name of all Israel. So that's an intention one says before doing a mitzvah, but he says that's not enough. That intention is important, but it's not enough to actually achieve the goal of the mitzvah, which is, of course, dveikut, that closeness to God. He says that's not enough. He says, I'll keep reading the text. This would be held by one to have completed the matter. Now, completion is called cooking. Okay, this is gonna get intense with the amount of metaphors to the text, but just hold on. So the completion is called cooking. And when we say that fruit is ripe, that something has been cooked, it's completed. To explain this before going on in the text, he's not wrong about this. Cooking, when in Jewish law, actually completes the matter. If you've ever wondered about mevushal wine, for instance, about kosher wine, if you look at the back of a wine bottle, it says mevushal or not mevushal. For instance, here on the back of my tiny grape juice, In Hebrew, there's the word mevushal. I'll try to hold it up to the screen so you can see it. Let's see if it'll focus on it. It says mevushal. I see that it's not really focusing on it, but take my word for it. What that means is that the wine itself, or the grape juice in this instance, has been brought to a boil for a moment. It's been cooked. And that completes the process of the wine fermenting. It can no longer ferment. This is important because for kosher wines, if you've ever been to a fancy function with traditional Jews, the wine must be mevushal. It must be cooked in order for it to be served by non-Jewish waiters. Because for kosher wine to be kosher, somebody Jewish has to be involved in every step of the way. And if somebody who's not Jewish, is involved in pouring the wine, then they've, in a sense, been part of the cooking of that wine, and it's not kosher. So whether or not you hold that personally, this is just the classic, fact about, Jewish law and kosher wine. But the way around that is you stop the cooking process you stop the fermenting process by cooking the wine or the grape juice. So anyway, he says cooking is a completion of something. Therefore, we're going to continue in the text. The verse continues, you shall not cook a kid. And the word gedi for kid is from the word haggadah, which is to tell. Gedi is the word for a kid. Lo tavashel gedi bechelev imo. You should not cook gedi, a kid, in its mother's milk. And gedi, he says, comes from the word haggadah, which is to tell, to say something. This refers to telling of the thing at the beginning. Whether one wishes to study the Torah or that one wishes to offer his prayer, do not complete it through the milk of the mother, i.e., do not be satisfied that you have completed the matter by having it in the milk of the mother, namely the root idea, in that you thought and expressed it verbally, that you do it with this intention. Chelev here, milk, means here the best, and this is an obvious meaning to the word, he says. Do not do this, but even during the act itself, also have your thoughts on heaven and do it with fear and love. The illustration is of an infant who has been weaned and who no longer requires the mother's milk, but can eat for himself. So he says, what is this verse doing? You should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. He says what that means is you should not imagine that you have completed the matter by having the original intention, by only having that original intention. Do not imagine that you have completed that the goal of connecting this mitzvah to God by having that original intention. Now, let's take the two verses together. In the Torah, you're welcome, if you have a Tanakh, to see this verse for yourself. Exodus chapter 23, verse 19. The whole verse was, the first fruits of your land you should bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. How does the Hozei of Lublin understand this? He says, the first fruits of your land you shall bring to the Lord your God. The first moment of going about your worldly pleasures, eating, drinking, making money, you should take that first moment and dedicate it to God in thought and in speech. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. But when it comes to mitzvot, prayer and Torah study, do not imagine that you have completed the goal of connecting to God through this mitzvah only through that first intention alone. Rather, mitzvot, prayer, Torah study requires intention the entire time in order to achieve the potential that is within each of those. Mitzvot, Torah, and prayer to connecting to God. Okay, we did it. That is not an easy Hasidic text, what I love about it is the permission that the Hasidic rabbis give themselves to take the text and to use it in ways that they know are going to bring deep meaning to their congregants, that it will inspire them to be closer to God. These mitzvot of breaking first fruits, not cooking a kid in its mother's milk, seem antiquated. We don't have a temple. Even though we, live out that verse about not cooking a kid in its mother's milk through the laws of kashrut, still, even the language itself, is antiquated. We don't do that. We don't take baby goats and cook them in milk. We just don't do that. But what does he do? He takes those verses and he makes them deeply meaningful to those who he serves. So, I'll share with you one more text from the Hozei of Lublin, and it is a much simpler text, so you don't need to worry. This one's not going to hurt our heads. We'll just enjoy it. He says, a rabbi asked the Lubliner, "Why do you stop to take snuff in the midst of prayers when interruptions are forbidden?" Good question. Now we learned that the Hozei of Lublin liked to use snuff in prayers. And this is what the Hozei replied. He replied with the following story. A king heard a street singer playing his violin and singing. He found it to his liking and invited the troubadour to sing at his court. In the middle of a song, however, a violin string would frequently break, and the king was forced to wait until it was replaced. Finally, a courtier asked the violinist why he did not have the entire instrument restrung in order to avoid interruptions. "I'll tell you," replied the street singer. "The king has many musicians with perfect instruments, and could order any one of them to entertain him, yet he seems to prefer my playing. Hence it appears as if he were willing to hear me play my imperfect violin. Likewise, the Lord has many hosts of singing angels, yet when God orders us mortals to pray to him, it's clear he is willing to endure our frailties." So the answer that the Hozei of Lublin gives to this rabbi who challenges him and says, "Why do you pause during prayers for snuff?" He says, look, he essentially says, in order for me to have the right intention to pray to God, I need a little bit of snuff if I'm going to focus. And the reason that I feel it's okay to pause is because I'm not perfect. And if I'm supposed to have the right intention, I need a break every now and then. That's his answer. I'm not promoting snuff, but I am promoting the idea that as humans, we are not perfect. And if God wants our prayers, then when we pray to God, we have to own up to that fact that we're not perfect. And we have to bring all of our imperfections with us as we stand before God. Okay, we have time just for one more story from the Hozei of Lublin. Just another example of the frailties of human beings and the power that has before God. So he says, when the poor, ignorant village peddler returns to town shortly before dark and ignoring his fatigue and ignoring hunger, hastens to the house of prayer to recite the afternoon and evening services, the seraphim and the ophanim, these heavenly angels, tremble before his worship, for it splits the very heavens. Even in our imperfections, actually, he says, especially because we're imperfect, when we, strive and push ourselves to serve God amidst the world, the world of, pleasure and business and distraction around us, even the angels cannot compete in our connecting to God and our holiness. Just the words of somebody who, amidst their worldly affairs, takes a break and prays to God, their words cause heaven itself to tremble. So with that, we'll close the book on the Hozei of Lublin this week, and we'll continue next week. So next week, important announcement, our class is going to start at 9:15. Havdalah is going to be a little later, and so Hasidut is also going to be a little later. I will see you then. Wishing you all a Shavuot Tov, and see you in a week.